Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural lecture of the Institute for Global Prosperity's Asia Prosperity Hub. The Institute for Global Prosperity has recently formed an Asian Prosperity Hub to bring together its work on South and East Asia. My name is Professor Henrietta Moore, and I am the founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity. So the event today is the first in a series on gender and prosperity. And the aim of that series is to try to bring a gendered perspective to the terrain of prosperity. First of all, by challenging the conventional myth that economic development will naturally lead to gender equality and better quality of life for women. Asian countries from Japan to Korea and more recently China have shown really rather different story. And we're going to hear today from our speaker about much of this, including India. According to the Global Gender Gap Report 2021, which is compiled by the World Economic Forum, gender gaps in Korea, China, and Japan, for example, are so wide that they're ranked 102nd, 107th, and 120th out of all the countries of the world on gender equality. And this, of course, is in very sharp contrast with their economic status in the world. Because in terms of GDP per capita, Korea, China, and Japan are roughly 31st, 79th, and 33rd out of 181 countries. In other words, we can't see a straightforward relationship between GDP growth and certain indices of economic development and the status of women. And although some countries like China have attained enormous success in relation to economic progress and human capital development in the last 20 years or so, gender gaps are actually widening. And we have a strong sense across the world that gender is becoming once again a battleground. So this urges scholars to think harder and to dig deeper as to what prosperity means for different social groups, especially historically disadvantaged groups with systemic inequalities of race and gender and ethnicity and so on. And that means that if we're to take prosperity seriously, that is to redefine it as we wish to do for the 21st century, we have to look again at some of our theoretical assumptions. So today I am delighted to welcome Professor Jayati Ghosh, who is a distinguished economist and public intellectual. She taught economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi for nearly 35 years before joining the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in January 2021. She's authored or edited 20 books, published more than 200 scholarly articles, and consulted for many international organizations and advised governments. And she has two recent books, The Making of a Catastrophe, COVID-19 and the India Economy, and When Governments Fail, COVID-19 and the Economy. And she is very well known for her text, Women Workers in the Informal Economy in the Global South, if I remember the title correctly. She's received several prizes, including for distinguished contributions to the social sciences in India and Italy, the International Labour Organization's Decent Work Research Prize in 2010. She's advised many countries, including India, was chairperson of the Andhra Pradesh Commission on Farmers' Welfare and a member of the National Knowledge Commission of India. She's the Executive Secretary of International Development Economics, Associates, an international network of heterodox development economists. Professor Ghosh sits on the UN High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs, and in 2021, she was appointed to the WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All. So we are very, very delighted to welcome you today, Professor Ghosh, and perhaps we could get right into it, and I will just offer you the floor and you can tell us some of your thoughts. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you so much also for that really generous introduction. And it is such a pleasure to be with you all, with Yuan He, whom I have seen develop as a scholar from when she was first doing her PhD research, and to be in contact with so many of you bright young students and faculty at the LSE. sorry, at the UCL. So I'm going to actually take up some of the issues that Professor Moore has so succinctly outlined in terms of, does prosperity mean different things if you take a gender perspective? But I'm actually going to, in a way, kind of first reverse the question. So let me begin by asking how much of this prosperity in Asia is actually due to the work of women, recognized and unrecognized. And this is something which is sort of appreciated at a very superficial level, I would say, and yet not really developed and not thought through even by policymakers who have relied very heavily on the economic contributions of women, even while they have not necessarily acknowledged them, enabled them, or remunerated them in any significant way. So particularly in Asia, I think Professor Moore highlighted how it is such a dynamic region, right? I mean, it has the fastest growing economies in the world, the fastest reduction of poverty over, if you take the last 30 years, historically the fastest reduction in poverty, certainly in China and East Asia, much lesser extent in India, but even we had some poverty reduction until about 7 years ago. And it's been seen as the success story of globalization, if you like. I mean, generally everybody sees it as one of the regions that benefited from global integration, both trade and financial integration. I think we have to recognize that East Asia is significantly different from the rest of Asia. So it's much more successful, it's much more diversified, it has achieved more rapid growth of per capita income and more structural transformation. And I mean, of course, China is deeply highlighted, but countries like Malaysia and Korea certainly have significant achievements in that regard as well. But a large part of that dramatic expansion was really based on the recognized and unrecognized labor of women. So I'm going to take up, first of all, this whole recognized part, the work participation rate, as we call it. And before I get into that, it's probably worth explaining to those who are not necessarily familiar that work participation, as we generally define it, is really employment participation. It's whether you get paid for it or not. And that's quite different from the actual work you do, because you can do a lot of work that is not paid. And fortunately, the ILO finally got around to recognizing this in 2013. The International Conference of Labor Statisticians finally expanded the definition of work so that it wasn't constrained by only the things that enter into the national accounts, but it recognized work that you do within your household and your family, for your personal consumption and your family's consumption and your community's consumption, whether or not you get paid for that. And that was a big difference, because then, as you can see, employment is just a subset of the work. But work participation is a kind of good indicator of, in a way, even the status of women. Because two things. One is that women, when they get recognized employment, they get incomes. And we know that incomes bring you respect, whether we like it or not, in society, in your families, in general. And so as more and more women get employment and they get paid for it, their status in society improves. But also, the less that you see of well-recognized work participation, the more it means that societies don't actually value women. And they don't really stop to consider what they're doing. They don't stop to think that they're contributing to the economy in any particular way. And that's as true of public policy as it is for society in general. And so often you can even see the women's recognized work participation rate, the employment rate that I've been telling you about, as a kind of proxy for women's status in society. I think we will all have to admit, unhappily, that my own country, India, has a really terrible record in terms of women's status and empowerment. And we also have one of the lowest work participation rates in the developing world, and it's a rate that has been falling through a period of economic growth. And that has something to do also with not just, it's both a cause of and caused by low status of women in society. But let's look at the dynamic ones first, the good stories, the success stories. So let's look at those success stories. The East Asian miracle. Everyone recognizes that the East Asian miracle, you know, the four tiger economies, as they were called, of South Korea, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, and Singapore, were really led by export-oriented manufacturing. And subsequently, we had the ASEAN 5, okay, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., Thailand, etc., which also expanded very rapidly on the basis of export-oriented manufacturing. And since then, we've had China, which is like the classic example of dramatic expansion on the basis of export-oriented manufacturing. Now, what is remarkable about all of these countries is that at the peak of this drive, you had more and more women as workers in this export-oriented manufacturing. And it meant in these countries, in the tiger economies and ASEAN 5, it meant very dramatic increases in women's workforce participation rates, like a doubling within 10, 15 years. So, you know, countries would go from 25, 35% women's workforce participation to 50, 60, 65%. That kind of dramatic increase in recognized workforce participation in less than a generation. At its peak, the export-oriented manufacturing production relied on anywhere between 60 to 75% women workers. So that will tell you. And in some export processing zones, it was as high as 90% in some pockets. So heavy reliance on women workers. Now, why was this? How come suddenly there was this massive increase in women's work? And it's really because the women's work was found to be in many ways cheaper and more convenient. So what is the issue here? First, you see most women do not see themselves as, if you like, the primary breadwinners for their families. They see themselves as secondary earners. Or if they are young women, they see themselves as, you know, earning for their as savings for their later life or to send money home to their families. And this really means that they have what we call a lower reservation wage. That is, they're willing to accept lower wages. So first of all, we find that the export-oriented manufacturing of these regions, when it was dominated by women workers, employed mostly young women workers between the ages of 18 and 30. In fact, it's remarkable. A study of Metro Manila in the export processing zones there in the mid-90s found 95% of the women workers were under the age of 35. And so what's going on here? Well, there are many things. First is that you are getting these young women who are offering themselves at lower wages. Typically, they are more amenable to control. They are less likely to unionize and, you know, demand more things. And anyway, they're asking for lower wages. They are willing to put up with pretty difficult and demanding work conditions as well as living conditions, you know, often housed in these huge hostels and monitored very closely and so on. In addition, because they are young women, you can use the life cycle. Now, remember, a lot of this export processing work in manufacturing, whether it is in garments or it's in the electronics industry, it's very detailed. It requires a lot of eye-hand coordination. It's ergonomically quite disastrous. So there's high burnout. You really can't do this for more than 10, 12 years at a stretch. So you can use the life cycle. You can get young women at the age of 18, 20, and when they want to marry or when they want to have children, you say, fine, go on. You go out and live your life now you've earned, and your younger sister can come and take this job. So you can use the life cycle to take women in and use them before the burnout, if you see what I mean. Because these are very high burnout activities, it's well recognized. So that's the second reason why they were highly preferred. And of course, all this meant that the women who were powering this export boom, and they really were, they were actually working at much lower wages. Their work was much more flexible in the sense that they could be thrown out very easily. It was a so-called flexible labor force that employers didn't have to worry about having these long permanent contracts and so on. If the demand fell, you said, okay, go back. Now we'll call you back when the demand comes again. When we get new orders, we'll call you back. And all of this made it much, much cheaper. The wage gap in these countries with these high export was shocking. I mean, women got anywhere between half to 60% of the male wage on average. And you found in the textile and garments and in the electronics that not only was the wage gap very high, but it was largely because of occupational segmentation. The women were doing all the work in the factory floor, the men were the supervisors, the managers, the checkers, you know, so that there was this hierarchy that enabled the male control over the women's production process. Of course, there were horror stories, and there continue to be horror stories as we go, you know, these industries then moved on. But what's really interesting about this is that it did this whole, you know, used this life cycle approach, which was something that fitted very strongly into what is now recognized as the emergence of global value chains. So it's hard to know, it's a chicken and egg thing. Did Benetton and Nike and Gap and everybody start the process? Did they just benefit from the process? How did this happen? But you really had the emergence of major multinational producers without factories themselves, who relied on these locals who produced these things in value chains and largely relied on this cheaper labor of women. At, as I said, much lower wage rates, much worse working conditions, hardly any social or legal protection of any kind, very little social security, which they didn't even expect because they saw this as a sort of temporary employment that they would then leave once they got married or had children and so on. Okay, so the global value chain as we know it is actually something you can't understand without this whole, you know, dependence on women's labor, but it is rarely talked about. And it came to the fore, or it comes to the fore only when there is some really major crises, you know, like a factory fire. There have been some extraordinary, terrible ones in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and so on. Most recently, people have heard about the Rana Plaza factory in Bangladesh, where many young women died, and so on. But that's only when it comes to the fore. Otherwise, all of this is sort of subterranean. It's under the surface that it is happening. But here's the thing. It's again one of these social processes. The more women you employ, and this is certainly what happened in South Korea and Malaysia and so on, the more women you employ, the more there becomes a social demand for slightly better conditions for these women. So that, you know, they start demanding better conditions, they start demanding more bio breaks to be allowed to use the loo when they need to, they start demanding social security, the gender gap tends to reduce. And we saw this happening from the mid-1990s onwards in these countries. And as that happened, because of the fact that you then cost more for the employer, because of the fact that you were then becoming more like the men workers, they became less attractive. And so you had more and more technological progress that was labor displacing in these countries. And the new employment went to men. And here's another interesting feature of the gendered nature of employment. When the work is, you know, there's all this talk about how women are the weaker sex and stuff, but when the work is physically more demanding, more arduous, more difficult, women do it. And this you see across the developing world, whether it is really back-breaking stuff like rice transplanting, or it is construction work. You know, in India, when you didn't have mechanized construction, you had the scaffolding and people carrying weights. It was women who would carry weights on their heads up scaffolding and so on. When it becomes mechanized, when you get machines to do something, when you get, in construction, hard hats and protection and gloves and machine drills and hydraulic lifters and so on, it's the men who do it. And this is really what happened also in a lot of these export-oriented zones. They started using less and less workers. They moved to more skilled workers, and those skilled workers were inevitably men. So that, you know, there were these phases in all of these countries. There were these phases of massive increase of women workers in factories, followed by a reduction. And then these same companies move to cheaper locations. So from ASEAN 5, they go to the next range of ASEAN, to, as I said, from Thailand, etc. They go to Myanmar, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. So you get a general shift to newer locations where you can still get all of these very cheap women workers with the same characteristics of, young and amenable and exploitable and so on. And then in the others, you move to the so-called higher value elements of that global value chain, which are driven by men, which are powered more by male workers. So what happens to all those women workers? Where do they go? Well, many of them end up doing effectively putting out work in their homes, piece rate work, or they get into self-employment of fairly basic and often desperate types in different ways. And we have seen this across Asia. That they're still contributing, by the way, to the economy. They are still actively contributing even to GDP, but now in even worse and more fragile conditions, because then they are responsible for their own protection, if you like. They don't have an employer to whom they can demand either legal or social security or anything. Now, that's one aspect of how this gender division has powered this massive economic transformation in a large part of East Asia. But then there's the other part, which is the unpaid labor part. And that's huge as well. So what exactly is unpaid labor? It's all the other work, which doesn't necessarily enter into the national accounts, because a lot of it is done within communities, within households, for your own family or your extended family, the care work and the extended care work as we know it. Now, it's interesting because, our notion of work is such a fluid notion. And especially when you take a purely monetary definition of what constitutes employment, you really, it's such a fuzzy area. So much. Basically, what is work? It's anything you can delegate to someone else. That's, anything that you can potentially delegate is potentially an economic activity. And it's only when you don't delegate it that it's not seen as an economic activity. Now, once you start thinking of it that way, everything except your own consumption and leisure is something you can delegate. So we think of motherhood, for example, as, a personal, non-economic activity. But you can delegate breastfeeding. Historically, societies have delegated breastfeeding. You've had wet nurses for, throughout feudalism, but, even in very unequal societies, even in India today, a lot of upper caste women hire wet nurses and so on. So that's delegated, and that's an economic activity. Someone is getting a wage for feeding a child. Motherhood itself, the very act of delivering a child used to be seen as something that you simply cannot delegate, but we have surrogacy. And it turned out to be one of the fastest growing exports of the state of Gujarat when our current prime minister was the chief minister. Surrogate motherhood, where women basically impregnate themselves with, and have a baby, go through 9 months of pregnancy and have a baby for someone else for payment. It's an economic activity then. So what I'm saying is that, you see, when a woman has her own child, the labor force statistics say she's not in the labor force. But when you do this for payment, and you potentially can, then you are an economic agent. So the notion of work, as you can see, it's very fluid. It's a gray area. It's not something that is very clear-cut and demarcated. But nonetheless, some labor force surveys do explore a little bit more what is called, the primary activity. And so, for example, the Indian data, we actually ask questions about what you generally do. And they have these two categories. They called Code 91 and Code 92. Okay, so what are they? Code 91 is very quaintly termed household duties. You can all guess what household duties are. It's the whole package of care work, okay? Care for the young, the old, the sick, those who, can look after themselves but won't, in terms of cooking, cleaning, other kinds of care, the works, okay? That's household duties. And then you have Code 93, which is extended care activities as well. So it's all the people who do household duties, plus they do additional stuff, such as fetching water, fetching fuel wood for household consumption, doing kitchen gardening, raising poultry, tutoring your children, making things that you're going to use in the house, like baskets or weaving or cloth or anything. All of these are also considered not in the labor force. But of course they work, and of course they are contributing to economic activity. But they're not seen as such because they are unpaid. It turns out in India, as I mentioned to you earlier, we have one of the lowest labor force participation rates in the world for women, and workforce participation is even lower, okay? So we began in the 1990s with around 36% women's workforce participation overall. It was about 40% in rural areas and only 18% in urban areas, okay? But still very, very low, and over time, it has fallen. In 2017-18, it fell to 18% average, can you imagine? Of which rural was only about 22 and urban had fallen to, I think, 12 or something. The latest pandemic type labor force survey, can you imagine, it gives us 11% women's workforce participation. It's a complete collapse of recognized employment, of paid work. Now, mind you, this category of recognized work even includes something called unpaid helpers in the family enterprise. So if your husband owns a shop, or if you are a farming family and you help in the fields, you're not called a farmer. You're not called a worker. You're an unpaid helper in the family enterprise. Because you don't have the land title, so you're not seen as a farmer. You don't hold the ownership of the shop. You are not seen as a trader. You're an unpaid helper. And that's a growing part even of that collapsing workforce participation, which tells you how much of women's work is simply unrecognized. So then is it simply that all these women are sitting around at home twiddling their thumbs? No. It turns out that the big increase between 93 and now has been in what is called Code 93. Okay, that is all this unpaid care work within the home and the extended care work, fetching water, fetching fuel wood, all of those things that I mentioned. And 40% of the women said they are fetching water. Okay, fetching water, which they were also spending more time on average, fetching this water. Because the water sources were further away, even in urban areas, you had to wait longer in queues, you had to make more trips, all of that kind of thing. And fetching water means what? You're carrying buckets, on your head and your shoulder. I mean, it's incredibly arduous and demanding. I promise you, I've tried to do it. It's impossible. I could not. So we are talking about extremely physically demanding work, which is not even recognized as work being in the labor force. And so when we say low women's work participation rate, it really means that there is this massive increase in unpaid work done by women. Now, what is striking is that, of course, things collapsed during the pandemic and so on, but all this happened during India's economic boom. 93 to 2011-12, okay, is India's economic boom. That's when we emerged on the global stage. Everybody's celebrating that we're the next, big Asian giant, and it's going to be the Asian century, and et cetera, et cetera. You remember all the hype, or maybe some of you are too young to remember, but there was a lot of this hype. And then it turns out that it was this period when women's recognized work collapses and gender gaps grow. And it's really because this is an economy that relied on the unpaid work of women. Now, the other point to note about this, I'm emphasizing India here because it's a very stark example, but similar kinds of things were happening in other countries. Not as sharp and extreme, but the broad tendency. What happens when you have so much unpaid work of women? Because there's a continuum, right? So it goes from unpaid to paid to very privileged women like myself who don't face a gender wage gap, who are in the professional elite category where we get similar wages to men and so on. There's a continuum. But when you have more and more women doing this unpaid work, what happens? First of all, it means that any work that women do is not valued by society because they're doing so much work for free. So when they come into the labor market, they can command a much lower wage. I mean, if you can get their work for free, why would you want to pay them too much anyway, right? So they get lower wages. And this is particularly true even for public employment. So it's not just private employers. Of course, private employers exploit this completely. But even the government relies on underpaid women workers to run its public health programs, to run its child nutrition schemes. We have what are called voluntary workers or activists. Our national health mission is run by something called accredited social health activists, ASHAs. The word ASHA means hope. It's a cruel irony because ASHAs are not paid either the government's minimum wage or the legal minimum wage because they're not called workers. They are activists. So they get an honorarium, which the official national payment for ASHAs is still 500 rupees a month. It's less than it's about £6 a month, something like that. That's what they're getting as an honorarium. And similarly, the child nutrition, maternal and child nutrition program runs on workers who work in those nurseries, and they get, again, this, trivial amounts, 3,000 rupees, slightly more than the ASHAs, but really just, way below even the legal minimum wage, because it's classified as part-time work. Actually, they end up working sometimes 12-hour days, but officially the work is only 6 hours. So you don't have to, it's not called a normal 8-day work, and they're not seen as regular employees. So first of all, the first implication, that society and the markets undervalue the work of women when there's a lot of unpaid work done by women. That's the first important implication. The second important implication is that when they do enter the labor market, they get clustered into low-paying occupations. Just as I mentioned, the frontline health workers, care workers in general, domestic workers, nursing, childhood pedagogy, teaching in nurseries, that kind of activity. And that also has, these are definitely then the low wage occupations, to the point where even when men do it, they face that wage penalty. In other words, everybody who does that, the occupations in which women are clustered are low wages, no matter whether you're a man or a woman. And this is also true even in factories. I mean, in India, in manufacturing, we have a type of cigarette called a bidi. It's a local leaf which is rolled up. And bidi rolling is a dominantly female activity, incredibly low paid, where even the men who do it get this very, very low wages, and so on. So there is therefore this occupational segmentation and clustering into low wage activities. And the third implication is that public policy can then use this fact of unpaid labor to provide a cushion. You can cut down, and by the way, this is global. You can, when fiscal austerity so-called happens, what do you cut down on? You cut down on social services, because this will be done within the family by unpaid labor of women and girls. So you have that cushion to play around with. You can exploit that gender characteristic. So, a lot of the times we're going around saying, policy is gender blind. It's not gender blind. It's fully aware of that gender difference, and it is exploiting that gender difference. It is using that gender difference because it can push certain kinds of public spending reduction as opposed to others. And finally, all this operates as a huge subsidy to the formal economy, to the recognized economy. So this comes back to the point I made about the dependence of economic growth on these gender differences. You take, let's say, India, we were not known as a great manufacturing hub, but the economic sort of success of India was exemplified in a lot of services exports, particularly in the IT industry, right? Everybody saw software. There was all this rather banal, and it turns out no longer relevant, statements like China is the factory of the world, India is the office of the world. So there was this whole explosion of software industries. Why was Indian software so cheap? Partly, yes, we had relatively very good, professional, educated software professionals, right? But why were they so cheap? Because there was an entire support system and substructure that enabled you to pay them relatively little. Whether you take the top, Tata Consultancy, Infosys, and all the big Wipro, all the big software companies, they relied on a support subsystem that included maintenance, catering, security, driving, all of the logistics and support facilities that were massively underpaid. And most of all, they relied on software professionals who could get domestic work for practically nothing, who could pay domestic workers well below a legal minimum wage, because of the fact that the labor market enabled that, and because women's work was so undervalued. So even our success stories are shiny, modern, top of the range success stories were based on this fundamental exploitation of an informal economy, and within that, a gender division of the informal economy. So as I said, many examples, I could give you many more, but I want to get on to a slightly different topic from this. But you can see how, therefore, Asian prosperity was powered by these gender differences, massively. Now, what's changed in the recent past? What are the current challenges facing this model, if you like? And there are. In other words, this is not anymore a feasible model. It worked for a while, and it created enormous success in some countries. Not so much in my own country, but certainly in East Asia, it created enormous material success, and per capita GDP grew and all of that. But this is really no longer a viable model. And there's a number of reasons for this. One is that, the global financial integration of Asia has not been to its advantage. Once again, I'm leaving China out because China is exceptional in many ways, including in the fact that it has increasingly limited its international financial integration, much to the consternation of The Economist, the Financial Times, and everybody else who represents the City of London. China is actually not encouraging sort of free-for-all financial integration. And I think part of the reason could well be because they've seen what it has meant for countries like South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on, which is that they have really suffered from this integration. It has been costly for these economies. Financial integration in these economies has meant that they are ending up paying more in terms of the interest and dividends and other outflows of the money that's invested in than they get in return for the money that they send out. And they send a lot of money out. It's not just domestic investors and savers and so on, because now it's all, even their savings, pension funds, everybody is financially integrated. But it's also the central banks, who are holding huge reserves because you want to have that cushion in case there's a crisis. And so central banks are putting their money in the safest possible place. No surprises, US Treasury bills, which, as we know, interest rates have been close to zero now for more than 15 years. And so you're getting really low returns on the assets you hold outside, but you're paying pretty high amounts on your liabilities. And in these, if you could call them these seigniorage costs, they're really high. For some countries like Thailand, they're as high as 5 to 6% of GDP every year you are losing just from this seigniorage cost. And at the same time, you are very vulnerable and fragile. The least thing can cause an outflow, and then you'll have a balance of payments crisis, your currency will collapse, your domestic banking will face all kinds of difficulties. So in other words, you are more vulnerable, you are more fragile, you are more prone to crisis, and you're losing money. Okay, so clearly financial integration has not been a success for developing Asia. It hasn't really added to investment. Investment rates in many of these countries have come down, not gone up. Remember that these are countries where the development project is still incomplete. Okay, maybe Korea, that's not true, and so on. But for most of these countries, there's still a lot left in terms of achieving, even upper middle income status. So the development project is incomplete, which means you need more domestic investment. Yet we have set up systems and structures that reduce domestic investment, make us take our savings outside rather than domestically, which is crazy. We then have the impacts of climate change. Asia is a major, major victim of climate change, and it's already happening. Many of our coastal cities across Asia are under threat. We are facing desertification, we are facing more earthquakes, we are facing more soil denudation, we are facing major rainfall changes that have altered the patterns of monsoons and necessarily require cultivation changes. We are already experiencing climate change. And yet, adaptation, I mean, nobody's really thought about adaptation properly. We haven't put in the money for it. We're not invested in it. Globally, no one's thinking about it. At COP26, there's a little separate stream that no one talks about on adaptation. There's no money for it. The poorer economies have, no investable resources available for it. And yet we're facing these impacts, which are affecting agriculture, affecting water supply, affecting habitations, so causing displacement and climate refugees, and so on. Then, of course, remember that this is a model that was based on a particular pattern of trade and on GVCs. We now have, first of all, if you like, the impetus created by Trump, and everybody thought Trump was an aberration, but no, he actually created a new trend. We have to recognize that the Biden administration has not reversed the trade policies of Mr. Trump. They have actually continued on that because they represent a particular, may I put it this way, they represent the trade requirements of a declining power. And the Chinese interest in free trade is the typical trade requirement of a rising power. And so we are getting this massive divergence where we are going to see increasing protectionism and shifting trade, reshoring, a decline of certain kinds of GVCs along with a proliferation of more oppressive GVCs in the world, and technology changes, which, let's face it, we haven't even seen the full impact of these. But new developments in 3D technology, in artificial intelligence, and in robotization really mean that this whole thing that you will require cheap labor locations to offshore certain parts of your production process, those are no longer really on the cards to the same extent. Which means that industrialization as the path to prosperity, or export-oriented industrialization as the path to prosperity, is no longer the sort of obvious no-brainer that it was 10 years ago. And of course, then we've had the pandemic. And of course, one remarkable feature of the pandemic, again, I'm leaving China out. It's been exceptional in many different ways. We can talk about that later. The other countries, what it did was it didn't just hold a mirror to the inequality or do an X-ray to the inequality. It dramatically accentuated inequality. So it fed on the existing inequalities, social, economic, and other, and it has massively accentuated and exacerbated them. Now, maybe I'm an economic determinist, but I believe that societies cannot tolerate this level of inequality for very long. And it will necessarily generate all kinds of unpleasantness, is the polite way of putting it, social and political tensions that with unforeseen consequences, including economic consequences. And so this is, if you like, a rather depressing context. So what's the way out? What's the way forward out of all of this? And how do we then think of a gender-aware, just, environmentally sound, sustainable recovery? Or let's not even call it recovery, a way out of this mess. What's the strategy out of this mess? So I think the first thing we need to do is, and here I'm then going to critique myself. Here I've been saying, okay, here are all the different ways in which women contribute to the economy. But that's part of the problem that we economists have imposed on society, is that we're always looking at how X and Y benefit the economy. Whereas what we should really be asking is, how does the economy benefit humans and nature and society? In other words, what is the economy we need that will actually give us a socially just, sustainable society? That's what we should be asking, not oh, if you put more women into the economy, you'll get that much more GDP, which is the typical kind of thing World Economic Forum is always doing. No, we should be saying, listen, wait a minute. The economy is there for a purpose. The economy is there to enable the survival and flourishing of life in all its forms. So let's think of the economy we need for that. You had mentioned earlier that, I'm on a WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All. Mariana Mazzucato is the chair of that. And it's a wonderful council, it's all women. But, our basic premise is this, is what's the economy we need for health for all? Our goal is health for all. Now let's think, what are the economic policies, practices, institutions, regulations? What do we need to get that? And that's really how we should be looking at the economy in general. We should be saying, what are the economic policies we need? We don't care if it gives you more GDP, less GDP, the same GDP. We're saying, what are the things that will give us these other outcomes? Sustainable livelihoods, decent work for all, a recognition of care work, reduction of the very arduous forms of care work, redistribution of that care work between families, societies, public and private sectors, and men and women, and remuneration of the paid care workers, proper remuneration of the paid workers. So what are the strategies we need for that? That's what we should really be asking. And so we have to focus on the care economy. We have to have massive, significantly increased public investment in the care economy. We have to focus on green jobs. And that doesn't just mean in, the sort of obvious things like retrofitting and all that, but particularly agroecology. The greenest form of agriculture is not large corporatized farms. It is smallholder agriculture based on sustainable agroecological practices. But we are really undermining that. We're not supporting that. We are reproducing a global food system that is completely broken, that is unsafe, unhealthy, and environmentally damaging. We have to change that. We have to go in for new forms of energy. Now, renewable energy, decentralized, is actually cheaper than the carbon emitting fossil fuels. But we have to get out of the scale economy argument. Renewable energy doesn't mean you have to have miles and miles of grid. It means you can actually set up small, localized, decentralized production and use that energy locally and create green jobs there. So we need to change the way we look at all of that. And we need to bring in the public investment and the regulatory practices that will prevent private companies from grabbing and controlling knowledge. The intellectual property rights regime has been a disaster for human sustainability, and I would argue a disaster for the planet. We have seen how it has actually led to death because the control over vaccine knowledge has limited the production of vaccines and caused second waves, third waves. We don't even know now what will happen in future waves because we are not vaccinating the whole world. And it is also leading to a lack of proliferation of the basic knowledge we require for both mitigation and adaptation. So we have to change that. We basically need what I have called a multicolored global New Deal. There's a lot of talk about a global Green New Deal. I'm saying it has to be multicolored. Of course, it has to be green, obviously, right? For all the reasons that everybody knows now. Climate change, the environment, etc. But it has to also be blue. I think people don't realize how critical water is, especially in Asia. We have the water wars of the future in Asia. I mean, the wars of the future in Asia will probably be fought over water, not over energy. There's this massive, we are polluting our rivers and our water bodies. We are bringing down our water tables. We are destroying our oceans. And those implications are going to be, they're long lasting. So we really have to have the blue in our deal. We have to be purple. Purple has been seen as the color of the care economy. And as I've talked about how important care is. And we have to also remember care is hugely employment generating. It's one of the things that technology cannot fully replace. It can assist, but care is relational. You have to have a human being responding. And so It cannot ever be substituted by a machine. And so a purple, and it has to be red, redistributive, basically. It has to be, in that sense, a focus on reducing inequality. Okay, I think I have talked for too long already. Forgive me, but we can get on to questions now. Yes.
Wow, thank you very much for a most fantastic talk. So before we get into questions from the floor, so people are thinking about it, I wondered if we could just have a minute or two discussing between us. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. So I was very taken with the idea of, you know, women powering this export-led boom, and then finding that as their conditions improve and their wages rise, that they're kind of pushed out. So there's a sort of decline in women's employment. And this has very, very serious effects, of course, because as we know, mothers in employment generally have daughters who do better in education and so on. So there's a very circular effect here of a generational impact, which will come back in years to come. But I'm wondering, is there any value in looking at sort of other historical precedents for this? I mean, I'm thinking about the very large number of women who were employed, for example, in textiles at the beginning of the industrial period in England, and then disappeared really from the labour market, and then he came back as a result largely of the Second World War, one way or another. So do you think is there any value in trying to understand whether we understand these processes of boom and bust from an economist's point of view, looking at gender? I think you're mute. You're mute. Sorry.
Sorry about that. I know I keep doing this. Yeah, you know, I think we do understand the economic processes. You know, one of the things that the textbooks get all wrong in economics is this assumption of the fixed labor supply.
Yeah.
You know, all the growth models and everything, they all tell you that there's a fixed labor supply. It's the growth rate of population N, which is going to give you labor supply. That's complete nonsense. Okay. Capitalism has always adjusted labor supply to demand. And three classic ways of doing this: you bring women in or out, you bring children in or out, and you bring migrants in or out.
Yeah.
So, you know, labor supply always adjusts, and which one they choose really depends on the sort of social dynamics of particular situations. And so when too many women get employed, and then perhaps, you know, first of all, they start demanding high wages, so the employers don't like it so much. And then they get uppity in the homes, and then the husbands don't like it so much. And so, you know, so then there's a social pressure to rely more on, let's say, migrants instead of on women's. So there is, in other words, you can see these dynamics playing out in many different countries. Italy is a classic example of this, actually, as a developed country. But you can see this in Korea today, or you know, in some of these countries as well. So yes, there is this dynamic. What is interesting, though, across the advanced world, you have higher women's workforce participation rates now. And that's really because more and more of what women used to do as unpaid work within the home is now outsourced. In other words, you buy more of these services in. And it's not just the obvious services like cleaning and so on. It's a lot more food is processed, a lot more other kinds of care is outsourced. So in fact, there was a very interesting study done for Canada some time ago by Marjorie Griffith-Jones, who looked at the expansion of the service industries in Canada. And she said something like 70% of it is just this. It's stuff that was done inside the homes, which is now being done in a marketed way, you know?
Yeah, that's
and therefore adding to GDP.
Yeah. But it also raises interesting questions about, this is, you know, for me, something that I'm very concerned about in relation to Africa. Is the way in which, okay, we have an economic system which is still, even with everything that we've done, and still listening to everything that happens at COP, is still talking about GDP and still talking about productivity as the way out of these issues. So, you know, but even so, behind that economic fixation, in a sense, and with the big international organizations that are important for this kind of thinking, there's still an understanding that there is a clear pattern of structural transformation in the economy, so that you will be, you know, agrarian leads to, industrialization, which leads to service, which leads to we don't know what, except of course we're at this point now where, massive deindustrialization for many countries have not even have achieved industrial levels, very high levels of urbanization, but not of industrialization. So when we look at the future of places like Africa, we can't imagine, we haven't got a theory of the structural transformation of the economy that's actually functioning as far as I can see. I mean, how do you think about that? What do you feel about that?
Yeah, I also, this is really a challenge. It's absolutely what you say. But I remember I worked with UNCTAD. They did one of their trade and development reports was precisely on this issue of structural transformation. And these trajectories, premature deindustrialization, stalled industrialization, all of these are so common in Africa. I think the problem is really that, as I mentioned, industrialization is not the solution now in terms of employment, because it will not employ more people. However, you can't get away from industrialization as a critical element of the industrial transformation because of all the knowledge synergies, because of the fact that, even if it's not going to give you more jobs, it gives you the potential for higher value added activities, let's say in services or in other sectors. And so I think increasingly, and what I believe many African policymakers are now realizing, is that you have to think of industrialization, but in a different way, not necessarily export oriented, that you're doing all the cheap handicrafts or cheap, garments and stuff, the same model that was used in Asia. Not necessarily that, but regional based industrialization that will enable some kinds of diversification towards higher value added activities of different kinds. And the pandemic has accelerated that. There is a real push now for domestic drug production. And I say domestic regional drug production. Yeah. They are setting up hubs. This is something the African Union and the Economic Commission for Africa are actively engaged in. 3 different pharmaceutical production hubs in Africa, because they realized you cannot rely on other people. Or other countries. So for your own resilience, you need that. Most of the increasing industrial shares in some economies in Africa is exporting to other African countries. So, I think this whole emphasis on regional economies of scale and on creating regional hubs is something that they are beginning to recognize. How that will play out, so much depends on the politics and all the internecine kinds of concerns and so on. But I think if you recognize that, you're not going to get the jobs out of manufacturing, but you have to promote the manufacturing, because otherwise you lose out in general. And you can't do that without some kind of protection, not national if you're a small economy, but let's say regional protection, some control over the intellectual property, some ability to create your own knowledge, all of that I think is essential.
Yeah. No, very, very, very interesting. So let's go to the floor because we're getting excited here. So first question.